My name is Roger Berkowitz, as you know, and this is a lecture sponsored by the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce this lecture tonight. You know, often we invite people we know, and it's reunions, and there's something wonderful about that as well. Tonight, I got to meet our speaker just about 10-20 minutes ago. I got to meet him really about a year ago when I got sent the manuscript for his new book, The Political Humanism of Hannah Arendt. And one gets sent these manuscripts every once in a while, and they're usually with dread that you open them and begin reading. But this was one where, as soon as I began reading it, I had the feeling that this was going to be one of the better books I had read, and it was. It's certainly one of the best books on Hannah Arendt that I've come across, it takes on her whole work in many ways. It does so in a very readable English prose, and with a wonderful humanism to it. It really does get at many of her deepest concepts, and so it was an obvious next move to ask Michael McCarthy to come up here and speak about his book. It was also very easy because he only lives down the road, and he's been a teacher at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie for 38 years, if I get it correctly. 38, 39. He teaches philosophy down at Vassar. And I guess it's almost an embarrassment that he and I have been neighbors for 8 years in this valley, and we never got to meet before now, and we're both working on Hannah Arendt. It shows how sometimes the academic world can be painfully navel-gazing, and I plead guilty in this case.
It's mutual guilt.
It's a mutual guilt. I don't mean to accuse, but there you go. It's a beautiful book, designed, I was just told, by his daughter, who's a web designer. Picture of Hannah Arendt, both of our favorite pictures of her, which is also in our book, the Thinking in Dark Times book. They cropped off the cigarette, probably for politically correct reasons. But you have to imagine that it's there because you can't have Hannah Arendt without a cigarette. In any case, it is a wonderful book. I'm looking forward to the talk, and so I'll just introduce Michael McCarthy. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Roger, and thanks to the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard for this invitation. My wife and I are very happy to be here. My reflections this evening are entitled "The Anti-Political Prejudices of Modernity, a Civic Humanist Critique." I cut down the talk, I think, just so that it would fit within the parameters that Roger gave me. I've also made a vow to keep my ad-libbing to a minimum, which I find extremely hard to do, but if I allow myself that liberty, I won't stay within the parameters that I have pledged myself to. So, with no further ado. I begin with a quotation from the Crises of the Republic. Quote, "No other human ability has suffered to such an extent from the progress of the modern age as the capacity for action, the capacity to begin something new." Hannah Arendt was neither a liberal nor a Marxist. In fact, her critique of the Western political tradition spares neither ancients nor moderns, neither classical philosophers and theologians, nor modern economists and social theorists. Arendt was rather a civic humanist, a reflective adherent of the civic, republican, and revolutionary traditions. My reflections this evening, undertaken in her memory, revolve around two closely related questions. Why was Arendt so critical of the political heritage of the modern age? why was the political promise of modernity never fulfilled? The unifying theme connecting Arendt's several answers to these questions is what she called the world alienation of modernity. So let us begin by briefly exploring what Arendt meant by world alienation. The secularizing trend advanced by Machiavelli in the Renaissance gradually weakened the hold of Christianity on the institutions and practices of the West. But for Arendt, modern secularization became divorced from what she called the spirit and culture of worldliness, from the love of historical remembrance and the fear of temporal oblivion that had inspired the Greco-Roman tradition. Her active conjunction of political humanism with love for the world is essential to her philosophical and political vision. Why? Because when human beings cease to know and care for the world, they lose appreciation of their inherent dignity, of their capacity, and this is not a phrase that she uses, but I think it applies to her, of their capacity for self-transcendence, of their potential for authentic greatness. As love for the world diminishes, so does the prevailing image of the human being. But human existence is partly constituted by our self-understanding, so that a diminished conception of the human person eventually leads to a denial of human dignity and liberty, and a willingness to treat other persons either as economic commodities or as disposable materials of nature. Arendt identifies many sources of modern world alienation. We'll only be talking about a few of them tonight. From Galilean science and Darwinian biology to Cartesian subjectivism. Clearly, these different sources are of very different kinds, and their causal influence occurs over several centuries. Yet she argues in The Origins of Totalitarianism that their historical convergence shaped the worldly conditions that successively led over 2 centuries to industrial capitalism, European imperialism, the ravages of what Europeans call the Great War, that's World War I, the political disintegration between the wars of Central and Eastern Europe, and the climactic emergence of totalitarian movements that began as mass movements and governments. For Arendt, it is the unprecedented horror of totalitarianism that concludes the modern saga of world alienation. In the totalitarian death camps, estrangement from the world, the radical denial of human dignity and liberty, and the leveling ferocity of ideology and terror coalesced. Now, this was not the fate of the liberal democracies in England, France, and the United States, which emerged as victorious after the Second World War. In fact, the liberal tradition, with its emphasis on negative liberty, limited government, the rule of law, and individual rights, directly opposed the concentrations of power that organized and administered the death camps. Adherents of liberalism in its various forms see themselves as the principal opponents of all despotic and totalitarian tendencies. But Arendt openly challenged the historical innocence of liberalism while acknowledging its important contributions to modern political life. At the theoretical level, she criticized classical liberalism, 19th century liberalism, for its social atomism, its instrumental view of political activity, its utilitarian account of the public good, its elevation of private happiness above the joys of Republican citizenship, its reduction of human motives to a narrow concern for self-interest and self-preservation. At the cultural level, she accused capitalist economic practices, and she always blended liberalism and capitalism, so much that she frequently referred to the liberalism that she was most opposed to as bourgeois liberalism, which is the politics that accompanies bourgeois capitalism. At the cultural level, she accused capitalist economic practices of eroding the bonds of political community. By encouraging limitless acquisition and ruthless business competition, the bourgeois ethos promoted social dislocation and class instability. The deep social antagonisms aggravated by capitalism, in her eyes, prevented the formation of a shared political culture based on common citizenship, a common language and history, and shared responsibility for a common world. At the institutional level, the economic imperatives of capitalism subverted the liberal commitment to equality under the law and to the consistent protection of individual rights, the core principles of the post-revolutionary nation state, where post-revolutionary here refers to the French Revolution. In their drive for unlimited profits, the capitalist bourgeoisie played the leading role, here she follows Rosa Luxemburg's argument, in the genesis of European imperialism. For Arendt, the overseas imperialism of the late 19th century, what Joseph Conrad called the merry dance of death and trade, inserted the acquisitive and annexationist ethos of capitalism into the foreign policy of the European nation-states. So, in the early 19th century, bourgeois economics undermined the social cohesion required by a unified political republic. And by the century's end, the dynamics of international capitalism had subverted the integrity of European politics itself. Fierce imperial rivalries eroded into European solidarity, prolonged the savagery of the Great War, and contributed to the punitive and unworkable peace, the Peace of Versailles, that followed. Arendt's critique of liberalism did not, however, lead her, as it led so many others, to Marxism. Although she respected Marx's intellectual integrity, she distrusted his reductive anthropology and what she saw as his general hostility to politics and government. In her judgment, both liberalism and Marxism, the dominant political philosophies of the post-French Revolutionary era, both of them had severely diminished the human self-image, the tacit self-understanding that guides human thinking and acting. For neither homo faber, she liked to use these Latin phrases, the solitary artisan, think of the artisan in his or her studio, nor homo mercator, the capitalist trader, nor a phrase that she used frequently when referring to Marx, nor the animal laborans, the proletarian laborer, nor bourgeois captains of finance, nor despotic imperial administrators have the love and concern for the world that an authentic politics requires. For Arendt, only the dedicated Republican citizen, don't think Republican Party here, think of republics and a political philosophy that's based on trying to understand the dynamics and working of republics. So I'll try to indicate that by the approval in my voice. Only the dedicated Republican citizen, the informed and responsible political agent, meets these high civic demands. But according to Arendt, liberalism and Marxism converge in their suspicion of the citizen and of the human capacity for self-transcendence embodied in authentic citizenship. So that a credible defense of civic republicanism today, not ancient, but modern civic republicanism, must meet these powerful modern suspicions head-on. What then does it mean to say that the modern age, the 500 years of history, stretching from Machiavelli and the Florentine Renaissance to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because she thought the modern age came to an end with the use of nuclear weapons at the close of the Second War. What does it mean to say that this age was anti-political? On what normative conception of politics is this critical judgment based? Sympathetic interpreters of Arendt have distinguished two strands in her civic republicanism. The first is based on a Greek model, the Periclean model. The Periclean model of a heroic agonal politics, that's from the Greek word agon, meaning contest or struggle, in which citizens strive for worldly immortality through their memorable words and deeds. Let us call this model, the agonal model, the epiphanic, this is an epiphany, is the Greek word for an appearance or a manifestation, the epiphanic revelatory model, in which the self-disclosure of the political agent is primary. It's what he or she shows himself or herself to be through words and deeds spoken and done in public. The second strand is what I would call communitarian in nature. On this model, the exemplary political activity is that of citizens, like ourselves, freely gathering in a public forum, like this one, to deliberate, judge, decide, and act on matters of common concern. Here the emphasis is less on the heroic individual, the great man or woman, and more on the exercise of free and responsible self-government by a community of dedicated citizens. Now, the two strands are not mutually exclusive. They were joined in her thinking. They're not mutually exclusive, but the second strand, what I call the communitarian strand, is independent of the cultural presuppositions of classical Greek or Roman culture. The classical republicanism of the Greek polis and the Roman Republic, the very humanist ideal that was reborn with Machiavelli, especially in the discourses on liberty, effectively depends on the epiphanic revelatory model. But contemporary civic republicanism, people like Charles Taylor and Michael Sandel, for example, has divorced itself from the assumptions and limitations of the ancient city. Hannah Arendt was often accused of being nostalgic in her political thinking because so much of it, people claim, is based on the ancient city. And this communitarian model is trying to divorce itself from those presuppositions. In their common defense of public-spirited citizenship and active political participation, Taylor and Sandel and several other democratic theorists deliberately mute, lower the emphasis on the heroic agonal strain so prominent in Arendtian thought, so that in the following reflections we shall follow their lead by emphasizing those features of her political humanism least dependent on the Periclean striving for immortal glory. So what are the core elements in this more inclusive, more contemporary, and my judgment more relevant civic humanism? There are many strands, I'm just going to focus on 5 of them. First, the bond of human beings in political associations. What is it that holds them together and keeps them from drifting apart? There are many purposes for which human beings unite and act cooperatively. There are many partial interests that hold them together and separate them from rival groups with opposing agendas. Think of political parties. Distinctively political associations, political communities, are ways of being and living together in which citizens, that's the name we give to the members of political communities, are connected by a self or group transcending love that entails mutual obligations and responsibilities as well as rights. This self or group transcending love may be what Hannah Arendt called love of the world, or a devotion to justice, shared allegiance to one's country, call that patriotism, commitment to a common good, or simply the passionate desire to engage in communal self-government. This unifying or civic love or loves is typically combined with a hatred of despotism. Despotism is simply another name for arbitrary rule. It's combined with a hatred, an animus against despotism in all of its forms. It rests on the shared convictions that human beings are free, deliberative agents, capable together of directing their own affairs and providing responsibly for future generations. What Jefferson called in the Declaration of Independence, meeting our fiduciary obligations to posterity. Second, the dignity of the public realm. Because of their inherent complexity, human beings have both private and public concerns. To address their private concerns, they rely on marriage and the family, extended kinship relations, the fellowship of friends, and a broad array of voluntary associations. In the intermediary zone between the family, which was classically the locus of private concerns, in the intermediary zone between the family and the state government lies civil society, a distinctively modern phenomenon. You don't see any real recognition of civil society in either Greek or Roman thought. The voluntary associations, that's a phrase taken from de Tocqueville, constituting civil society, pursue both private and public objectives. While the agents of the state are, or ought to be, public officers charged with advancing the common or public good, the character of civil society is less clearly defined. Churches are part of civil society. Colleges and universities like Bard, Vassar, Harvard, and Yale are part of civil society. Labor unions are part of civil society. Business corporations are part of civil society. Public charities, like the Red Cross, a broad range of nonprofits that many of you may consider working for when you graduate, and a myriad of interest groups, of which we have an abundance, have both a private and a public face. While serving the needs and aims of their members, their decisions and actions clearly affect the common world to which all citizens belong. So they're intermediary between the state on the one hand and the family on the other. Now, the growth and complexity of civil society in the modern age has made a sharp public-private separation untenable today. This is, I think, one of the things that Hannah Arendt struggles with, especially when she draws her orientation from the classical republics. Still, it is vitally important, in my judgment, to distinguish between acting for the sake of one's own, one's family, one's group, one's limited and partial interest, and acting for the sake of the comprehensive political community, acting for the sake of the country as a whole, for example. Now, for Hannah Arendt, a distinctively political mentality, this is one of the things I love most about her, a distinctively political mentality, a particularly distinctively political mindset, a distinctively political way of thinking and speaking and feeling and orienting one's attention and focusing one's concern should be adopted, this is normative, should be adopted when entering the public realm. She describes this political cast of mind as, quote, an enlarged mentality. It's capacious, it's open, it's comprehensive, it's responsive to the needs and concerns and perceptions of the other. And this enlarged mentality enables citizens, if they can appropriate it, enables citizens to rise above their narrow and partisan interests to speak and act in public for the common weal. To achieve an enlarged mentality, it is an achievement. No one is given with it. The farthest as the father of 3 daughters, I can tell you one of the distinctive marks of children is the complete absence of an enlarged mentality. Children are egocentric. That's simply their nature. They have sympathetic affections, don't get me wrong. But the idea that they're going to think and speak for the common weal simply isn't appropriate. We have to acquire this. And one of the places, hopefully, in our culture where we can still acquire it is in a place like a liberal arts college. To achieve an enlarged mentality, citizens must be free from the urgent demands of biological necessity. It's very hard to have an enlarged mentality when you're starving. And partisan attachment to the limited ends of self or group, because then you'll simply be seeking in the public realm to promote the ends of that group. The dignity of the public realm then rests on each citizen's capacity to rise above personal need and partisan interest, to deliberate, decide, and act for the community, and to find happiness and joy in caring for the world with one's peers. Third, the intrinsic importance of action and speech. So what do citizens do when they enter the public realm to enact the affairs of the world together? Essentially, this is why she called speech the preeminent political capacity. Essentially, what citizens do is talk to one another. They converse. But their incessant communication is not aimless. It is, I believe, guided by a larger purpose to promote and preserve the present and future well-being of their community. This concept of the public or common good is often criticized as amorphous, but I think that's because it's not well understood. As articulated in the preamble to the United States Constitution, it's very hard to memorize the whole of the Constitution, not because it's very long, but because it's complicated in its articles. But the preamble is memorizable by everyone. It's only about 6 lines, and it's the most eloquent portion of the Constitution, and I think it gives us guidance into what I'm calling the concept of the public good, or the common good. As articulated in the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, the public good includes strengthening a people's political union. Obama speaks frequently of a more perfect union. Establishing and securing justice, ensuring domestic and national peace, promoting public prosperity, and, this is the final phrasing of the preamble, securing the blessings of personal and public liberty, I'm adding those words, for future generations. When citizens deliberate and debate, when they choose and act in concert, and when they reflect on the intended as well as the unintended consequences of their actions, this is an insight that the conservatives are generally more attentive to than the group that we call liberals today. They're very sensitive to the unintended consequences of actions. These are among the public goods that they hope to define and achieve. Now this is particularly important because the public realm is open to a plurality of citizens, each with his or her own opinions and judgments, and because it is based on persuasion and argument rather than personal authority or coercive force, and because political agents, all of them, even the ones we most admire, are fallible and often short-sighted, our personal conceptions of the public good and of the best ways to promote it do not often prevail. Most of the political loyalties I've held in my life, and I'm now 70 years old, have ended in defeat. Okay? But the failure to achieve the policy objectives we advocate does not mean that our speech and action were futile. Political achievement, and this is one of the great things that the media has done to distort our understanding of politics, should never be measured the way sports events are measured, by a narrow calculus of victories and defeats. By acting with integrity in the political give and take, by respecting the rights and opinions of our civic peers, by remaining civically engaged in the face of inevitable setback, we help to keep the space of appearances alive and free. We also create bonds of solidarity and mutual respect with those who support and oppose our political judgments. It is a sign of the anti-political character of contemporary politics that sense of civility or civic friendship transcending differences of policy, almost complete absence of it, is an indication of just how much we've lost. Even sports, which we base most of our discussion of politics around, the players are friends with each other when they're not competing on the field. We not only have the competition in the field, we've turned it into enmity between people. Anyhow, I promise not to ad lib. I'm going to have to skip more than I thought, Roger. Jump ahead. So the fourth part I'm skipping is the part about the cognitive or epistemic dimension of politics, which I think is almost completely neglected in contemporary treatments of politics as a contest of power. It is in part a contest of power, but it's also a place where deliberation based on our understanding of the world, our sense of what the appropriate ends of public life are, and our struggle together through deliberation and argument to arrive at a better understanding of them. But I'm going to skip that to come to the final section. Public liberty. The concept of public liberty is at the core of Hannah Arendt's political humanism. In fact, she uses her understanding of human freedom to distance herself from both ancient and modern political theories. On her account, which I don't really agree with, but for the sake of our commemoration of her this evening, we will give her her due. On her account, classical philosophers like Plato deliberately sought freedom from the burdens of political activity so they could concentrate their energies on the philosophical life. She finds a parallel strain in Pauline Christianity, the Christianity articulated by Paul in his epistles. As Paul encourages early Christian believers to withdraw from the affairs of the world in the imminent hope of their personal salvation. So that in the Arendtian story of politics, both the Platonic and Christian traditions emphasize freedom from politics, not freedom for politics, not for citizenship, because of its alleged limitations, ontological, epistemic, moral, and religious. The opponents of political liberty in the modern age have a significantly different agenda, rooted in distinctively modern prejudices, not the prejudices of Plato and Paul. Descartes removes freedom from the realm of appearances and relocates it in the interiority of the disembodied ego. Scientific determinists like Spinoza reduce freedom's reality to the Stoic acceptance of invariant and exceptionalist natural laws. Early defenders of capitalism, commercial capitalism, like Adam Smith, place the acme of freedom in the unregulated transactions of buyers and sellers in the commercial exchange market, what people call today economic liberty. Utilitarians like Bentham identify freedom with the hedonistic pursuit of private pleasure and happiness. Dialectical materialists like Marx claim that genuine freedom must wait for the emergence of the classless society. The modern tendency is either to deny or restrict the reality of freedom, confining its exercise to private pursuits, the pursuit of private happiness, or to the interior life of the mind and the heart. There are few defenders of public liberty, what Hannah Arendt called the lost treasure of the civic, republican, and revolutionary tradition. The few defenders include Machiavelli in Discourses on Liberty, Montesquieu in The Spirit of the Laws, and preeminently This is, I think, her great political mentor, Alexis de Tocqueville, in Democracy and America. These are Arendt's mentors in the School of Political Freedom. Yet they are somewhat marginal thinkers, overshadowed by the dominant modern intellectual traditions, scientific naturalism, Cartesian subjectivism, economic and political liberalism, Marxist science of historical necessity. So that in asserting the critical importance of public liberty, Hannah Arendt is actively resisting the most powerful intellectual and cultural currents of the modern age. The public liberty she ardently defends has two complementary dimensions. Authentic Republican citizens must be free from the grip of natural and historical necessity, the reductive constraints of partisan self-interest, and all forms of despotic coercion and paternalistic authority. Effectively emancipated from these barriers to liberty, public-spirited citizens are free to participate disinterestedly in the governance of their political community. By freely engaging with their peers in public affairs, they exercise distinctively political virtues and enjoy a unique form of public happiness. So, why did these core elements of the civic humanist tradition, love of the world and the joys of the public realm, the commonly recognized dignity of action, speech, common sense, and deliberative reasoning, the intrinsic value of political agents, events, and communities, the exceptional treasure that is public liberty, why did they become neglected or forgotten in the modern age? What were the theoretical, cultural, institutional, and social forces that undermined the credibility and power of the civic Republican vision? Now, I think this is going to be there's a long answer to this question, but we have limited time tonight, so I'm going to give you the short answer. And I'm going to just choose one dimension of what is a much more complex analysis for reasons of time. This section is going to be called the imperial assumptions of economics. By imperial, I mean that they try to create an empire of thought based on these assumptions. The unprecedented centrality of commerce in the modern world changes the nature and spirit of the public realm. The commercial exchange market, that's where people go to buy and sell, has a strikingly different ethos, character, from the Greek political community or the medieval cathedral. Human beings come to the public marketplace, as opposed to the public assembly, to show their wares, to buy and sell commodities, to satisfy their private needs and desires, to acquire wealth. Enlightened self-interest is the operative rule of commercial exchange. We all follow it. The stated ideal is to buy cheap when things are for sale and to sell dear when the market is high. And let the buyer beware. The commercial society founded on trade gives a new meaning to human plurality. In politics, it is the plurality of civic agents and political opinions that matters. Citizens refine their views of the common world by actively debating them with their civic peers before they take action together. But in the exchange market, it is the plurality of interests, not the plurality of opinions, that counts. Prices rise and fall with fluctuations in supply and demand. Buyers and sellers pay no heed to the common good as they zealously pursue their private desires. As Robert Heilbronner has argued, modern capitalism was and remains profoundly dynamic. The commercial capitalism of the 18th century, celebrated by Adam Smith, was rapidly succeeded by the industrial capitalism of the 19th century, radically challenged by Marx. Productive manufacture shifted from the familial household and the artisan studio to the large urban factory. The skilled crafting of durable artifacts Think of the craftsman, individual craftsman, for public purposes or private patrons, was superseded by the mass production of tangible objects for sale or industrial use. The harnessing of steam and electrical power, the division of labor, the creation of an urban working class, increased reliance on machines as sources of production, the building of canals and railroads and airports, the accelerating pace of technical invention, new sources of finance and credit, the unrelenting demand for greater speed and profit, made 19th and 20th century capitalism the most dynamic sources of change and innovation of the world. We may not like it, but that's simply how it worked. So economic practice and theory deeply informed the cultural outlook of the West. By the 19th century, a new set of assumptions about human existence, and you're going to see how these vary from the civic humanist principles I articulated a little bit earlier. By the 19th century, a new set of assumptions about human existence became widely accepted by, quote, enlightened thinkers, particularly those involved in shaping the new human sciences, or what we call today the social sciences. We shall refer to these reductive anthropological prejudices. It's not that there's no truth in them. And calling them reductive, this is my aspect about their imperial characters. They confine, they restrict us, they exclude us, unless we make a conscious effort to overcome it, from thinking about the world and thinking about ourselves in different ways. Now, what's crucial to understand is that these prejudices were shared by liberals and Marxists. They're not a division between the liberal and the socialist tradition. They're equally held by both of these traditions. So what were they? Okay. About 5 minutes. The true basis of human association is economic. The most important reason, these are the assumptions, what I'm calling the imperial assumptions of economics. The most important reasons human beings join in cooperative activity is for the production, distribution, use, and consumption of material goods. All other human purposes are subordinate to the preservation and extension of individual and species life. Second, the underlying motive of all human activity is self-interest. It is the pursuit of material advantage that drives the behavior of individuals, groups, and social classes. Normative appeals, as in civic republicanism, to disinterested and principled action are either hypocritical or naive. Such high-minded appeals actually serve as a veil for self-interest, or as a deliberate or unconscious strategy for duping the gullible or pacifying the oppressed. Moreover, ostensibly disinterested, self-transcending activity is not the true cause of the common good. Because for classical liberals, there's an invisible hand at work in the marketplace, creating national prosperity from the passionate pursuit of private gain. And for their Marxist adversaries, the dialectical laws of history will generate a classless society from the historical antagonism of rival economic interests. What really drives human progress, according to these assumptions, is not the free and responsible actions of citizens and statesmen, but impersonal economic laws, the laws of the market, or the dialectical laws of class struggle. All human activities are to be measured and appraised in terms of their productive potential. Following Francis Bacon, because genuine knowledge is power that proves its worth through the fruits, consumer goods, and works, durable structures it helps to create. All non-productive modes of existence become suspect. The philosophical life, the life of citizenship, the very summit of the ancient ethical hierarchy of the best ways to live, are discredited by this modern suspicion. Theoretical contemplation, political words and deeds leave nothing durable and tangible in their wake. Fourth, the classical understanding of leisure, this is extremely important, is also overturned by this economic interpretation of human existence. For the ancients, leisure was the basis of culture. Freed only for a time, from the demands of necessity and utility, citizens at leisure were free for intrinsically liberal activities, in the older sense of liberal. These included prayer, public worship, contemplation, theoretical inquiry, the distinctive joys of the political life. These were the genuinely free activities in which humans exercised their very highest capacities. They encountered the divine. They delighted in the discovery of truth. They cooperated responsibly with their peers in caring for the world. But the modern economic mentality views these classical liberal activities as parasitic. Depending on the work and labor of others, they contribute nothing to the growth of public power and wealth. By modern standards, only productive activities and the steady creation of cumulative wealth are truly significant. So that for us, periods of leisure, weekends, vacations, are the recurrent periods of idleness that interrupt serious work. Leisure is to be filled with relaxation, entertainment, the replenishing of energy for the serious business of economic life, from Monday through Friday. So that Saturday and Sunday are for the sake of Monday through Friday. It's to get you sufficiently restored that you can go back to work. Finally, throughout Western history, the dominant economic class has always assumed the obligations of political leadership. This was true of the slave societies of ancient Greece and the feudal societies of medieval Europe. And until the European nobility lost their political independence to the absolute monarchs in the 18th century, the claims of noblesse oblige, which means that if you are in a position of economic power and privilege in the society, you have preeminent political obligations to that society. This is completely absent from the whole Wall Street mentality that we've witnessed. It's just the opposite of it. Okay, I won't wax furious on that. Okay, but noblesse oblige had some meaning. It wasn't that these ancient societies were just; they were not just. But at least those in positions of power and privilege assumed that they bore major political responsibilities. But the rise of the bourgeoisie was marked by anti-political prejudices. This powerful economic class explicitly embraced laissez-faire, so that merchants, bankers, and traders, what they insisted on was freedom from government interference and regulation, sound familiar, so that they could energetically pursue their economic gain. What the bourgeoisie demanded from government was security, the protection of their lives, families, properties, and investments, the guarantee of unimpeded economic liberty. Since the invisible hand would promote the public good, government should be minimal and non-intrusive. This is economic libertarianism. It was the titans of commerce, finance, and industry, not the political leaders of the state, who ensured the progress of the nation. Now, Hannah Arendt often criticized these assumptions under a sweeping historical rubric. She called it the triumph of the social over the political. But as Hannah Pitkin has carefully shown, Hannah Arendt's concept of the social has several distinguishable strands. It can refer, first, to the biological realm of existence in which we all live, the natural sphere in which concern for life and survival are dominant. It can refer to the economic domain in which we all participate, the realm of production and exchange, where the principles of utility and self-interest prevail. When I go to buy a house, I try to buy as good a house as I can, cheap. And when I go to sell my house, without being duplicitous about it, I try to realize as much profit as I can. That's simply the dynamic of the economic domain. The conformist behavioral patterns of society, whether that is the society of nobles or the bourgeoisie or wage-earning laborers, because Hannah Arendt argues society in all of its forms, including its hippie forms, requires that its members conform to conventional rules and expectations. The reductive outlook of the modern social sciences that treats human beings as anonymous members of statistical aggregates behaving in accordance with statistical laws. And finally, the bureaucratic institutions and culture of the welfare state, where what Marx called the administration of things replaces the responsible practice of self-government. Now, although these different senses of the social, biological, economic, the conformity required by society, the reductive outlook of the social sciences, the bureaucratic mentality of the welfare state, although these different senses of the social are historically connected, they clearly are not the same. And I think Hannah Pitkin shows this very well. For our purposes this evening, the relevant connections among them, though, are intellectual and cultural. All of these different domains, all of these behavioral practices, all of these restrictive mentalities are governed by casts of mind antithetical to the civic humanist principles I articulated. For neither biological imperatives of nature, economic ambitions, the conformity of society, rule-governed behavioral animals, nor political bureaucracies can inspire human beings to the enlarged mentality and enduring public spirit that is the mark of the genuine Republican citizen. Helping to educate young men and women for this high political vocation, the vocation of citizenship, is a democratic imperative for liberal arts colleges like Bard and Vassar. And our country's need for such citizens and the political renewal they symbolize has never been greater than it is now. Thank you.